Hi everyone. Today we are going to talk about wolf conservation in the United States. Historically, wolves have nearly been driven to the point of extinction, and although their numbers have been increasing within the past 20 years or so, they are still considered endangered or threatened in many regions. In order to make sure that the wolf population remains stable and/or increases in certain areas, it is important that we learn about their natural history and the reasons as to why they became threatened. This can help us understand how to protect them from future threats and facilitate safe coexistence with humans and other wildlife. We are going to start our presentation by discussing a little bit about gray wolves themselves, such as their natural history, a little bit about their group dynamics, and some facts about their physiology. In the following section, we will talk about the gray wolf's role in the ecosystem, such as their effect on trophic cascades, as well as their role as apex predators. After that, we will go over some of the reasons as to why wolves became endangered, as well as past and previous conservation efforts, using the Yellowstone National Park wolf population as a specific example. We will then conclude our presentation by talking about dog-wolf hybrids, as well as why wolves should be conserved and how we can all become wolf activists.
Wolves have been present in America for hundreds of thousands of years. Their range extended across the continent. While they have always represented a danger to humans, whether through direct contact or livestock predation, it was not until the 1800s that wolf numbers began to decline sharply. Prior to the 1800s, there were a number of major wolf species in the United States. The gray wolf occupied most of the U.S., but by the 1930s were virtually eliminated. After intense restoration efforts and a significant amount of political backlash, they have been reintroduced to America. Now, their range is restricted to the Great Lakes, Canada, and the Northern Rockies. The red wolf occupied the southeastern United States, ranging as far west as Texas. However, they were also driven out and now occupy only a small area within North Carolina. The relationship that Native Americans and Europeans held with the wolves were extremely different. Many Native American cultures viewed the wolf as one of the first entities of the world, possessing great power and sometimes knowledge. Europeans, on the other hand, viewed wolves from a Judeo-Christian perspective and aligned them with evil. During the 1800s, wolves were hunted as pests and driven nearly to the point of extinction. Theodore Roosevelt, despite his work establishing the national park system, referred to wolves as the beasts of waste and destruction. In 1872, Yellowstone National Park was established. While this could have been a productive first step towards repairing the dwindling wolf populations, the wolves were actually hunted to prevent them from preying upon more desirable game animals such as elk. By the 1960s, very few isolated populations of wolves existed in the lower 48 states. During this period, wolves were still prevalent in Canada and in Alaska. In 1986, a pack of wolves, referred to as the Magic Pack, crossed into Glacier National Park and established. The Magic Pack was significant because it was one of the first and only self-sustaining breeding packs in North America since wolves had been virtually eradicated. The Magic Pack's immigration was a watershed moment for wolf conservationists, and less than 10 years later, wolves were released back into locations in both Yellowstone and Idaho. These populations have thrived over time and reestablished as part of the ecosystem. The success of wolf reintroduction in Yellowstone has inspired conservationists for the last 20 years. It represents one of those most popular and controversial stories of conservation. The Yellowstone program helped establish the framework that many conservation efforts would lean on for years to come.
Wolves are carnivores and therefore consume other animals to obtain energy and nutrients. They feed on a variety of herbivores. While they typically hunt large ungulates such as deer, elk, and bison, they are known to also consume small mammals. Wolves are apex predators because they are at the top of the local food chain and they must compete with other apex predators for food. While they typically do not have to worry about being hunted by other animals, wolf populations can still be negatively affected by competition from other predators since they all consume the same prey species. Dependence upon a common food source allows wolves to both affect and be affected by the populations of other predators. Wolves are a keystone species. Without them, the ecosystem around them faces rippling effects and losses of biodiversity. The disruption of ecosystems can be fixed through reintroduction efforts that often yield significant results, like with the trophic cascades seen in Yellowstone. Reintroduction of wolves not only keeps herbivore populations in check, but also changes the behavior of their prey populations by causing them to avoid areas where they're vulnerable or have difficulty escaping. This allows previously decimated plant populations to flourish, allowing the return of species to these habitats. Wolves also control mesopredator populations. Mesopredators, such as coyotes, actually disrupt ecosystems and cause much more damage to farmers because they target prey like sheep. Apex predators like wolves suppress these smaller predators. Wolves have a significant control over the populations of ungulates and small mammals that they hunt. By capturing and consuming their prey, wolves prevent their prey populations from becoming too large. Because vulnerable individuals are often the easiest targets and are thus easier for the wolves to kill, prey populations are often healthier overall as a result of predation. Also, because wolves hunt the herbivores that consume much of the local flora, they also help regulate the density of local vegetation and can help prevent overgrazing. Changes in the population of wolves and their prey are often cyclical, with wolf populations increasing shortly after their prey populations increase, and decreasing after their prey populations decrease. This occurs because the size of the predator population affects the prey population, and vice versa. Wolves control the prey population through predation, and the prey controls the wolf population by serving as a source of food. As a keystone species, wolves have a very strong effect on the ecosystems in which they live. In addition to directly affecting their prey populations via predation, they also indirectly affect the organisms that either consume or are consumed by their prey. These effects on different parts of the food chain are known as trophic cascades. Wolves have an effect on the trophic level below their prey, which in this case would be plants, by controlling the amount of herbivores that consume the plant material, thus indirectly controlling the amount of plants that are consumed. So now, let's use what we've learned about the ecological role of wolves in order to predict various trophic cascades. What would happen to the herbivore and plant populations if the wolf population increased? What would happen to them if the wolf population decreased? And how do you think that competition from wolves affects other apex predators? So, first we're going to investigate the different relationships between the levels of our food web here. So, this level we have exclusively herbivores, deer, elk, bison, and rabbits. And they're herbivores, so they eat plants. So we'll draw the arrow from the thing that's being consumed to the thing that's doing the consuming. Now, at the top of the food chain, we have a combination of carnivores and omnivores. So let's start with the carnivores over here. Carnivores eat exclusively meat, so they must prey upon other animals. Gray wolves actually feed on all four of these herbivores shown here. While mountain lions mostly feed on deer and elk. Now, grizzly bears and coyotes are omnivores, which means they eat both plants and animals. So we know that they eat plants. And then for the specific animals, grizzly bears consume elk and bison. And coyotes will consume rabbits. So now that our food web is in place, we can use the relationships between each of the trophic levels to investigate what would happen if wolves either increased or decreased in number. So let's start with what would happen if the wolves decreased in number. If this population decreased, what do you think would happen to all of the populations that the wolves feed on? And if the opposite were to occur, say that the wolf population increased greatly, how would that affect the populations that the wolves consume? And finally, how do you think changes in the wolf population would affect the other carnivores and omnivores that the wolf competes with? Just take a minute to think about that, and then when you're ready, progress to the next slide to see the answers. If the wolf population were to increase, then the populations of other herbivores would decrease due to increased predation, and thus the amount of plant biomass would increase due to a decrease in herbivory. The exact opposite would occur if the wolf population were to decrease. The wolves are able to affect the populations of other carnivores by competing for the same prey as them, thus limiting their population growth by depleting a shared resource.
In this section, we're going to talk a little bit about how wolves became endangered and about some of the past and present conservation efforts. Gray wolves were almost completely wiped out by the government in the late 19th century and early 20th century. This was due to the complaints of local farmers and ranchers, whose cattle was under constant threat by the predatory wolves. So the government started a program called Animal Damage Control in 1885 and killed about 2,000 wolves in national parks alone. However, they did not anticipate the damage that would cascade about the entire ecosystem due to this mass extirpation. Elk populations began to rise dramatically as the wolf population declined in the early to mid-20th century. Because of this, the plant population, such as aspen and cottonwood, of Yellowstone and the surrounding areas suffered from overgrazing. So then the government decided to start a program to kill elk in mass numbers in order to minimize the negative effects of their increasing population. It was later determined that the overly large elk population was the most dramatic effect that occurred due to the absence of wolves. Several people suggested the reintroduction of wolves as an effective measure of elk control, but this idea was pushed back by farmers and ranchers. After the introduction of the Endangered Species Act in 1973, a small population of wolves was released into Yellowstone National Park. This experiment to establish wolf populations and restore ecosystem balance came with a promise to control wolf populations from harming both livestock and people. Here is a graph showing the trends in the gray wolf population in Yellowstone National Park. Although we can see that there has been a general increase in the number of wolves present, there are also fluctuations in the population. This means that the population decreases in some years and increases in other years. What do you think causes these instabilities? Pause the video here and think of a few reasons why you think these trends occur. Then move on to the next slide for the answers. So as we saw on the previous slide, there has been some occasional population decline in Yellowstone National Park. Most of this decrease has been in packs on the northern range. As you may have guessed, fluctuations such as these can be attributed primarily to the decline in prey population, such as elk, as well as available territory. Canine distemper and sarcoptic mange are two diseases that contribute to these fluctuations. Over the past 30 years, the wild wolf population in the United States has grown from less than 300 to over 4,000. As we can see from this graphic, wild wolves have made a remarkable comeback over the past 50 years. With cooperation from politicians, environmentalists, and ranchers, we may not have to choose between people, wildlife, and cattle. The wild habitat that is currently left across the nation could possibly support all three. Hopefully one day, we will be able to see wolves present across their previous historic ranges, coexisting peacefully with both humans, cattle, and other wildlife.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years. That the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds, of migratory birds, started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed. More pools formed. More riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
There have been a number of hybrids created between wolves and close relatives. Although it is now illegal in some states to keep a wolf dog, a wolf and dog hybrid, many are still being abandoned in other states where they are regulated, or outright legal. The figure on the right shows the legal status of wolf-dog hybrids across the United States. Another victim of human influence has been the coy wolf, a mix of a coyote and wolf common in the eastern United States. They have intermediate characteristics of both coyotes and wolves, but there has been increasing debate over another related species. The red wolf is considered a separate species from a coy wolf, but has the ability to hybridize with them. Recent studies suggest that the red wolf may not be a separate species at all, but just a coy wolf. This has led to debate over whether or not this species still deserves protection under the Red Wolf Adaptation Management Plan, where they're currently being protected through efforts to prevent hybridization with coyotes. Now we will move on to an activity discussing red wolf conservation. The ancestry of the red wolf has recently come under debate. Studies suggest that the red wolf may just be a coyote-wolf hybrid and should not be classified as a species, thus halting current conservation efforts. However, the coy wolf plays an important role in the ecosystem by replacing the role of the wolves driven out by human development. Should the red wolf be protected even if it's just a hybrid? Feel free to discuss. There has been a rise in the number of wolf-dog hybrids as people grow interested in owning a piece of the wild. However, they do not make good pets. The higher percentage hybrids carry more characteristics of the wolf and are even less suited to life as a domestic dog. They can kill small pets and can act aggressive and unpredictably around small children. They are often given to overflowing wolf sanctuaries when their owners become overwhelmed with this poor creature, or they may just abandon them. Please do not get one.
Now we're going to talk about some ongoing efforts to save wolf and wolf-dog hybrids. There are a number of increasingly crowded wolf sanctuaries located around the United States. I had the ability to volunteer at one, Mission Wolf in Colorado, a couple of years ago. There, they have a mission to spread education on the dangers of keeping these exotic animals as pets. They have around 30 wolves they keep in enclosures, as well as a number of horses. I had the opportunity to perform some of the duties, such as cleaning out fire hazards from the enclosures, removing dead trees and such. We also chopped some dead wood for firewood, and actually saw the process of the biofuel, which they make themselves. We got to process the donated meat that we fed to the wolves and fed it to them a couple days later. It was a really awesome opportunity, and I learned a lot, not only from the wolves themselves, but also meeting the ambassador wolves. Another such sanctuary, St. Francis Wolf Sanctuary north of Houston, is a similar thing. They have the goal of educating the public through outreach and through visits to their sanctuary. A great opportunity for yourself to get involved is to volunteer or visit one of these wolf sanctuaries for yourself.
A current issue regarding wolves involves their possible delisting by the government. They may lose federal protection entirely. Congress is considering a modernization of the Endangered Species Act to make it easier for species like the wolf to be delisted and give their management over to the states. Once wolf populations rebounded in Michigan and Wisconsin, for example, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service gave them wolf management. But soon after, federal courts ruled that the wolf populations were too vulnerable, transferring management back to the Fish and Wildlife Service and placing wolves back on the list. Now that they are considering a law to prevent federal courts from influencing Fish and Wildlife Service decisions. Something that you can do is call or write your congressman and urge them to continue protecting wolves federally. Finally, there is an intrinsic motivation to protect wolves. They are an embodiment of nature and provide educational material and interest in conservation. They are beautiful, fierce creatures that represent the wild. Protective efforts for these creatures actually have opened dialogues between stakeholders who may not have entered into discussion on this topic. We must protect this magnificent creature for future generations. Indeed, it has been said that the wolves' eyes are mirrors. What different people see in them is simply a reflection of ourselves. Could they reflect even more, not just a person's attitude toward wolves, but towards the environment, wild lands, nature itself?
So now you have learned about the issues affecting wolves and may be wondering how you can help. Congratulations! By watching this video, you have already educated yourself on why wolves need protecting. Some of the things that you can do, as previously mentioned, is to volunteer at a local wolf sanctuary. By volunteering at these types of places, you can care for wolves directly, and you can also raise awareness as to why wolves need protection and how their natural environment is under threat. You can also be active on social media by spreading awareness of how wolves and other types of wildlife are threatened. You can also join different organizations such as national or international wildlife organizations and donate to charities that care and protect for wolves. You can also contact your local politicians and inform them about the different threats that wolves and other wildlife are under. Thank you for watching.